This is not Japanese whiskey, and neither is this. This is though, and so are these and these. So what the hell is Japanese whiskey? The answer to that question is more complicated and more philosophical than you might expect. Welcome to Kanpai Planet, bringing you the world of Japanese drinks direct from the heart of Tokyo. And today we're taking a deep dive into the new Japanese whiskey standards. Over the last decade, Japanese whiskey has gained international acclaim, which has driven up its price. But despite this, there are few rules for what all of these expensive bottles actually should contain. Some companies have imported whiskey, bottled it in Japan, and then exported it out with a label saying Japanese whiskey. And this was all within the rules, because unlike Scotch from Scotland or bourbon from the US, Japan's whiskey carried no appellation of origin. In fact, bottling in Japan was the only real criteria. If you find that a bit shady, you're not alone. Back in 2019, the Japan Whiskey Research Center, an advocacy group, recommended guidelines to bring the contents of a bottle of Japanese whiskey in line with the reasonable expectations of drinkers. Nodding to these concerns, new standards have finally been announced on the 16th of February, in fact, by the Japan Spirits and Liqueurs Makers Association, a trade union of the major and some minor, but importantly, not all producers. Given that Japan's whiskey origins lie in Scotch, it's no surprise that these guidelines adhere closely to Scottish whiskey standards. They require that all Japanese whiskies be made with grain, including malted barley, that they be saccharified, meaning malted and mashed, fermented, distilled and matured in Japan for at least 3 years in wooden casks 700 litres or smaller. Distillation proof cannot exceed 95% ABV, and bottling must take place in Japan at a minimum of 40% ABV, and one type of caramel colouring, E150A, is allowed to be used. One interesting deviation from the original JWRC suggestions has been aging. They've gone with 3 years, like in Scotland, when the JWRC wanted 2 years because Japan has a more temperate climate, which can potentially lead to faster aging. There's also no stipulation on cask types, unlike in Scotland. The ambiguity over shochu aged in a variety of cask types, so-called rice whiskey, is out. It's not made from malted barley. Now, currently in the US, this cask-aged shochu does fit the legal definitions of whiskey. The new regulations take effect from the 1st of April 2021, but existing products have until 31st of March 2024 to comply. Now, there's currently no certification or approval system and no penalties for non-compliance. These guidelines only apply on a voluntary basis to JSLMA members. The Japanese government, the face of Japan's national tax agency, is expected to adopt these regulations at some point. And that's important because once they become law, they become enforceable and they will impact international trade agreements. The impact of the mere announcement of these guidelines was immediate. Nikka, Japan's second largest whiskey maker, announced on its website which of its whiskies comply with these new criteria. Yoichi and Miyagikyo single malts, Nikka coffee grain, and Takatsuru pure malt made the cut. Nikka coffee malt and Nikka from the barrel did not. Nikka from the barrel was launched in Japan in 1985. It was launched in the US in 2018 to almost immediate recognition. In fact, it won Whiskey Advocate magazine's Whiskey of the Year in 2018. It's much loved and a popular souvenir for whiskey lovers visiting Japan. Now, Nikka has been open for some time about the inclusion of Ben Nevis whiskey, a distillery they purchased in 1989, in some of their blends, such as the bargain basement Black Nikka Clear. Suntory followed suit and confirmed that their single malts, Yamazaki and Hakushu, and their blends, Hibiki and Toki, conform to the new standards, but their cheaper Suntory White, Red and Torres blends use imported whiskey. As for their biggest selling product, Kakubin, it depends where you are. Domestically, some of the whiskey used is not aged for the minimum 3-year requirement, but if you're buying Kakubin for export, you're good. So how will you know that what you're buying is Japanese whiskey? Well, Article 6 of the new standards says that as well as removing the word Japanese from the labels, producers will have to remove any mention of Japan's culture, language, history, writing, geography, or even a flag from the label. Why did it take so long for these new standards to emerge? Well, it's not a uniquely Japanese situation. The bourbon industry has been misleading consumers for some time.
Well, I admit it looks bad, Flanders. But haven't you heard of "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone"?
Oh! Got him, Dad!
The definition of what has been considered whiskey in Japan has always been loose, and for a long time this suited the big players. Even the now vaunted Big Two of Suntory and Nikka brought in a lot of molasses-based spirits from South America in the years after the Second World War to bulk up their cheaper blends. It wasn't until 1968 that alcohol labelled as whiskey in Japan was even required to contain any whiskey. Now a cynic could say that it now suits the big players again, with the premium Japanese whiskies winning awards and making money. Now ironically, the booming overseas demand for these premium whiskies coincided with the big players shuttering operations as domestic demand for whiskey fell. This led to them not having enough fully aged whiskey to meet this new demand. So both established players and the new startups turned to buying whiskey in bulk from overseas, which is part of the reason we're in this situation in the first place. Now, not many in Japan are actually misled by all this, because the biggest market for whiskey domestically is actually salarymen and OLs who want to drink after work, and for them purse is more important than provenance, and they're after a cheap highball rather than an expensive hibiki. It's telling to me that Suntory say, "We are proud that every Japanese whiskey we already export meets the new standards." Emphasis on export. One of the key impacts of these new standards is going to be on blended whiskey. Much of the fawning over Japanese whiskey over the last decade has played on cliches about Japanese craftsmanship. And blending is often considered the true art of the Japanese whiskey houses. It's one reason why they often focus on blending rather than distilling in their marketing material. Most blended whiskey is a mixture of malt and grain whiskey. Now, Japan is famous for its malt whiskey distilleries. It doesn't have a lot of grain whiskey distilleries, and it's the lighter, cheaper grain whiskey which makes up the bulk of most blends. Due to the highly competitive and adversarial nature of the Japanese whiskey industry, companies here do not trade whiskies for blends, unlike in Scotland, which is why they have to go overseas to source them. Now, could these new regulations lead to domestic companies trading whiskies? The first to open up might be Kirin, who have an oversupply of grain whiskey and have cut down on their single malt production. In fact, don't tell anyone, it may already have started. Kirin are suspected to have sold grain whiskey to Mars, which is in this, Asagi Madara, released last year. So, what is Japanese whiskey? Chichibu Distillery founder Ichiro Akuto, possibly the most famous living personage in Japanese whiskey, says that it's whiskey made by Japanese people. This answer may suit a man whose biggest selling product is a blend of whiskies from 5 different countries. But let's think about it. What if a lifetime Suntory employee goes and starts blending for Johnny Walker? Is she now making Japanese whiskey? Does it matter that the blender is genetically Japanese? Do they require a Japanese passport? Could a former foreigner, who's now acquired Japanese citizenship, make Japanese whiskey? Perhaps Japanese whiskey should come from the as currently defined borders of the nation state of Japan. But does that mean that every single component of that whiskey has to come from here? And at the end of the day, does it matter as long as what we're drinking tastes good? For me, it's a matter of transparency, knowing what you're buying, the zeitgeist of authenticity.
Authenticity, like whatever word we want to put against it, authenticity. For me, authenticity, and there's something bound in that authenticity that is so much greater.
Let's look at Matsui Shizo. They began distillation at the Kurayoshi distillery in 2017, yet they sell an 18-year-old pure malt from there. Yes, that's right, the maths don't add up. And if this wasn't blatantly pretending to be this, then we wouldn't have a problem. We already have a simple solution for what to call these non-compliant products. Ichiro Akoto coined the term world whiskey to describe Chichibu's blended house malt with imported grain components. The highly regarded Ichiro's Malton Grain, which contains components from Scotland, Ireland, Japan, Canada, and the US. Suntory embraced the idea in 2019 with the launch of Owl, the company's first explicitly labelled world whiskey, although the packaging does align somewhat with their existing Japanese offerings. A small Japanese whiskey nerd shout out to 10 distilleries, Kirin Seagram's world whiskey from back in the day. We are a long way from the transparency that companies like Compass Box offer, where they list in detail the component elements of their blends. But I truly welcome this very positive first step from the Japanese whiskey industry. Nikka from the Barrel remains one of my favourite whiskies that I can buy reasonably easily for a reasonable price in Tokyo. And I'm pleased to hear that Nikka intend to keep making it like they always have, whatever you want to call it. Until next time, Kanpai!